welcome to week 2 of Crim 103. So the bad news for this week is that the material that I'm going to cover in lecture is a little dry, at least maybe to some. I find it really interesting, but I can get why others think that it's not so exciting. The good news is that this lecture will definitely run less than 2 hours, so I'll let you get on with your day relatively quickly. So it's like one of the first lectures of the year. Why am I starting out with the dry information? Well, before we talk about some of the more interesting topics, I think it's really important that we get on the same page with respect to what some key terms mean. We need to make sure that when I talk about crime, I'm talking about the same thing that you're thinking about. When I'm talking about antisocial behavior, the same sorts of things or behaviors come to mind in your head as well. So we'll be talking about what is crime, what is a theory, to make sure that we're all on the same page.
You and I need to develop a shared aesthetic vocabulary.
We'll talk a little bit about different theories, including psychological perspectives on crime, and what I think is really interesting, which are developmental theories of crime, which are kind of like a subset of psychological theories. Developmental theories are what I focus on for most of my research. Let's take a little look at how we define crime and how I present to you my definition of crime in this post-COVID era. The reason why we're going to spend some time defining crime is that we need to have the same sense of what crime is when we're going to be thinking about these different psychological perspectives. But it's not just about what crime is. It's not just about its definitions. Where does the idea of crime come from? How come some behaviors get defined as criminal and others are antisocial? How come some behaviors are both antisocial and criminal? How come some behaviors are neither? So what goes into developing this idea of crime? Who gets to decide what is and what is not a crime? First off, crime is not biological. It's not innate. We have no natural law of crime the way that we have a natural law of gravity, motion, energy, and so on. Crime is socially defined. Although crime represents a social construction, there are different opinions regarding how crime becomes socially constructed. One perspective is the consensus perspective. The consensus perspective says that society has general agreement about what behavior is or is not a crime, and then society will dictate to government the responsibility of specifying that a particular behavior is a violation of a criminal code and is deserving of the specific type of punishment. And this is different from conflict perspectives on how a behavior becomes a crime. From a conflict perspective, there are certain individuals in power, the elite, the upper class, the 1%, however you want to refer to them as, and these individuals identify certain behaviors as more common amongst already marginalized or oppressed people. And the government or the elite will indicate that these behaviors are criminal as a way to maintain this social hierarchy. The reality is that, especially in Western industrialized nations, we probably have a mix of both consensus and conflict perspectives on crime. In the US, we can definitely see some more explicit examples of where the conflict perspective would ring true, not just in terms of defining certain behaviors as criminal and others as not criminal, but also in the response to these behaviors by, for example, fining individuals who are homeless for trespassing, states where they charge people to live in prison.
With intent to sell?
Half a joint. Plus, they said the charge don't even count as long as I don't get charged again.
Unless you get arrested again, not charged. One's easier than the other. You've already paid your entrance fee.
Yeah, my jail entrance fee.
You'll need $50 for the mandatory anti-drug class materials, and each class is $25, so that's $325 plus the $50, $375 in total. Are you able to pay this amount at this time?
No.
A payment plan will be set up for the remainder of your classes. Please pay promptly or a warrant will be issued for your arrest.
When it comes to crime in Canada, we can distinguish criminal behaviors in terms of behaviors that violate our criminal code. These are behaviors that are intentional or without justified excuse. So the behavior can only be criminal if it was intended or if somebody has no justified excuse for engaging in that behavior. So with respect to the latter, one example would be criminal negligence causing death. An individual may be drinking and driving and get into an accident. So it's not that they did it on purpose, it wasn't intentional, but they hit somebody and they caused that person's death, and the excuse that they have is that they're drinking, but that excuse is not justified. So that is how we would be able to prosecute persons who didn't intentionally engage in the behavior, but their behavior actually caused harm to others. We can also distinguish criminal behaviors in terms of whether they are mala in se versus mala prohibita. So mala in se translates to guilty in and of themselves. So this would be particularly serious behaviors that society sort of generally agrees are criminal, and this is true across different cultures, across different time periods. These behaviors are virtually always considered to be criminal. Mala prohibita offenses are behaviors that are sort of seen by the majority as non-normative behaviors, or behaviors that are worthy of being criminal because of the attitudes that people have at a particular point in time. One of the things that you can focus on for the discussions this week, what are behaviors that once were considered criminal but no longer are? What are some behaviors that you think are currently criminalized but should not be criminalized? So maybe our cultural attitudes or ideas about these behaviors are changing. We don't want to criminalize them. Now also think about some behaviors that currently are not being criminalized but you think should be. Another common term that we'll talk about is antisocial behavior. Antisocial behavior in a criminology context does not necessarily match up or align with how we might use the term when maybe we're talking about friends and we say, oh, I don't feel like going out tonight, I just feel like being antisocial. We don't mean that. When you use the term antisocial to describe staying in, you're more like saying, I feel kind of like introverted tonight, or I don't want to hang out with people, I don't want to really interact. This is more like in a criminology context where you say asocial. You do not want to interact with others. Antisocial refers to interacting with other people, but in a negative way. So this is usually where we see an individual violating some sort of social norm. Antisocial behaviors can include criminal behaviors, but antisocial behavior usually refers to a much broader set of behaviors that are also not criminal. So it could be like alcohol use, it could be driving too fast, it could be things like, I hate when these youths go up onto the bus and they've got their cell phone on and they're just playing music on the SkyTrain with no headphones on. What are you guys doing? And then you'll see like 60-year-old men doing it too. This is antisocial behavior. It's things that you should not be doing, but you do it because you don't care about norms, or maybe you're coming from a different place where this is normative and it's seen as okay, and this is where these conflicts can occur. Usually, when we're talking about antisocial behavior, we're focusing on youth. So in Canada, we would define a youth as someone between ages 12 and 17. 12 is the age at which individuals become criminally responsible for their behavior, and 17 is the end period at which an individual is prosecuted under our Youth Criminal Justice Act. There are two terms that you'll definitely need to know for your criminology degree, especially if you're taking, well, you have to, if you're going to get a Crim BA, you have to take Crim 220, and you'll hear about the terms conceptualization and operationalization a lot. So we're going to focus especially on conceptualization today, but a bit on operationalization as well. Conceptualization refers to how we define an idea, a word, or a construct. So it's basically just a definition. What is the meaning of this thing? When we use terms, we want to make sure we tell people what we mean by them so that we don't have a miscommunication. The operationalization of a term or word is how we go about measuring that construct. So we can define crime, but then we also have to measure crime. How do we make sure that our measures are reliable and valid? So we'll talk in this class today about 3 different ways of measuring crime. We can use official data, self-report data, and victimization surveys, and each have their strengths and limitations. These different strengths and limitations essentially boil down to which ones are more reliable and which ones are more valid. So when we're talking about reliability, we're talking about the consistency of our measure. So let's take a bathroom scale, for example. If I get on that bathroom scale 10 times in 60 seconds, that scale should read the exact same number every single time. If it doesn't, it means if we get the same thing, then it's reliable. But what if the same thing is we're always wrong? What if my true weight is X, but it's always X plus 5? What that means is that I'm actually inaccurate all the time. I'm reliable, and then I'm able to get the same thing, but it's not valid. So what we want for validity is to make sure that we're measuring what we're interested in accurately. So we could take a coffee bean and place it on a bathroom scale, and we would get the same answer every single time, but it wouldn't necessarily be valid because the scale wasn't designed, that bathroom scale wasn't designed to measure a coffee bean, nor was it designed to measure, say, an elephant. So we need to make sure that our tool, so our scale, is going to also be valid and not just reliable. One of the more common ways that we measure criminal behavior is through official reports. So this can come from several sources, usually police arrests, so history of whether someone's been arrested by police, for what crime, and so on. From courts, so what happens in the actual courtroom in terms of charges, what the judge sentences a person to. And then corrections, so this is once somebody has been found typically guilty of a crime, how are they processed through that part of the criminal justice system, whether it be through probation or through custody, some other type of community-based sentence. Official reports are typically very, very reliable because it's easy for criminal justice system practitioners to record details about the arrest or the charge or the conviction. Police officers are required to take notes about not just what date the arrest happened, but when, what time it happened, who it was, offense was perpetrated. These data are only capturing crimes that have been detected by the criminal justice system. So this is what we call the dark figure of crime. Crimes that are not detected by the justice system. And so measures of offending based on official reports are not perfectly valid because they fail to capture the dark figure of crime. One way to get around this is through self-report studies. So this is what I've often done when I would interview kids in custody, is ask them directly about the offenses that they've been involved in. And so one of the things that we're able to do is through research, we can guarantee confidentiality. So the conversations that were held between myself and a research participant were effectively like lawyer-client privilege. So they could talk to me about crimes that they've perpetrated in the past that they didn't get caught for, and that's one of the ways that we would figure out, okay, how much crime is actually undetected? What is the true dark figure of crime? So self-report studies tend to be a little bit more valid, but they can be less reliable, especially if you don't have a good rapport with the participants. So if they don't trust you, or if you don't have a certain level of confidentiality, they might be uncomfortable reporting certain crimes to you, or they might actually just like forget crimes or misremember crimes. They might be especially unlikely to report the crimes that are the most serious. So in addition to self-report studies are victimization surveys. So victimization surveys could be with the same sample. We could focus on offenders, but instead of asking them about crimes they've committed, we would ask them about crimes that they've experienced or been victimized by. And this can help us address that problem of, well, maybe individuals don't want to self-report serious crimes they've been involved in as perpetrators, but maybe we can get a sense of the prevalence of crime by asking people if they've been victimized or not, and what types of crimes they've experienced. Research since the 1980s has especially uncovered that sexual offenses experienced by college students are maybe much higher than once believed, and so victimization surveys have helped us learn about persons who maybe are not typically included in these sorts of research studies. A limitation of victimization research is that it can't capture victimless crimes. So for example, drug trafficking, technically it could have indirect victims, so the drug users themselves, but it's hard to figure out who the specific victim is in drug trafficking. Same with people who might carry a weapon. It might be illegal to carry a firearm in certain areas, but like I don't know times when I've been a quote unquote victim of somebody else carrying a weapon. So these are some of the limitations specific to victimization surveys. So one of the limitations that is common to both self-report surveys and victimization surveys is the issue of telescoping. So we experience this a lot, where an individual, let's say I'm doing an interview with a person that's in custody and this kid has been involved in a lot of offenses and he has a hard time remembering exactly when different crimes occurred. So he might tell me that he had committed a theft of a motor vehicle when he was 15 years old, but actually he was 16 years old. So this is what we call telescoping, where somebody reports the right event. So this event did happen, but in the wrong time period. And the problem is that we just don't get a good understanding of when certain crimes do or do not occur. So that's one of the limitations of both self-report and victimization surveys. So which one do you want to use? Do you want to use your official measures, your self-report surveys, or your victimization surveys? The best studies will want to use all three. So it's not that there are strengths and limitations of all three. You try to use a mix of all three in order to get a better understanding of the prevalence or frequency of criminal behavior. This is what we would call triangulation. Same type of information from different sources and then putting it all together. So let's take some time to talk a little bit about theory, which I consider is the backbone of criminology. Especially if you're going to be a criminology major, you're going to spend a lot of time learning about theory, whether it's psychological explanations of crime, sociological explanations of crime. This is how we sort of get guidance in terms of what we should measure. It helps us create research ideas. It helps us also interpret and make sense of findings. So if you're a crim student, this is really important for this class. Theories and perspectives that you'll learn, you're going to take with your term paper and apply them to a particular offender. So it's really important that you sort of find theories that you're interested in as well. What is actual theory? What do we mean when we say theory in criminology? This is where we link together a set of interrelated hypotheses, so a set of ideas or suggestions about a particular phenomenon, like crime. So it almost always involves specification of an independent variable and a dependent variable. Our independent variable is this factor or construct that we use to try and explain or make sense of an outcome variable. The outcome variable is our dependent variable. So we use independent variables to try to explain dependent variables. In criminology, we're usually using risk factors, let's say like impulsivity, poverty, drug use, to try and explain criminal behavior. So some measure of crime is typically always our dependent variable. Maybe it's, has anybody committed an offense before, yes or no? Maybe it's recidivism. Maybe it's frequency of offending or trajectories of criminal behavior over time. It can all depend on the research question. So once we've got these different themes that or interrelated set of hypotheses, we want to make sure that we're very clear about definitions. So what do we mean when we say impulsivity? What do we mean when we say drug use? How should we measure drug use? How should we measure criminal behavior? It's very important to be very clear on this because ultimately theory is great, but it's only really valuable if we go out and test it. So we can't just sit in ivory towers and develop these theoretical ideas. We have to go out, we have to pound the pavement, do the work, do the research, collect the data to test if these theories are accurate. The only way that I can test somebody's theory, let's say if I wanted to test social learning theory and the idea that individuals who have delinquent peers are more likely to be delinquent, I need to know what the theorist means when they say delinquent peers. Does it mean peers involved in antisocial behavior, or does it have to be criminal behavior? Is it peers that the person is actually friends with, or just people that an individual exposed to in school, in the classroom, that sort of thing. So we have to be very clear what we mean when we're using these different theoretical concepts. So because there are so many different types of theories in criminology, what scholars have done is develop different categories of theories, so different ways to classify a particular theory. Two of the most common theory types in criminology fit into what we'll call either consensus or conflict theories. So consensus theories focus on why crime does occur. What happens in somebody's life that influences their involvement in crime? So From a consensus theory perspective, something has to happen in order for crime to occur. One example is strain theory. So strain theory would suggest that an individual has to experience some negative life event to influence their involvement in crime. Control theories are a little bit different. Sometimes they're called social control theories, in that they focus on what has to happen in someone's life to prevent them from becoming involved in criminal behavior. One of the most common control theories is social bond theory. It's so popular, social bond theory is so popular, sometimes it's even just referred to as social control theory, but I think that it's very important that we make distinctions between social bond theory and other types of control theories. Social bond theory suggests that people will not commit crime if they're attached to others and if they're committed to others, if they're involved in different activities, and if they sort of believe in social norms. So in this case, what happens is that an individual will not commit crime if they are attached to others. Another popular control theory is the general theory of crime. It says as long as individuals develop self-control, they will not go on to engage in criminal behavior. Not all theories fit neatly into either consensus or control theories. And there's some pretty major theories, especially from psychological perspectives, that don't fit into these two boxes. So one of these perspectives is what we refer to as learning theories that include social learning theory. Learning theories or blank slate theories see people as neither good nor bad. Sutherland's differential association theory was sort of an example of this, where a person's environment was so important in sort of dictating whether something would happen to keep them away from crime or to influence their involvement in crime. Developmental theories are quite different. They're something that I've focused on for a while in my research, and what makes them different is, notice that to this point in time, we've basically talked about groups of people. So social learning theory, or let's use social bond theory, we say that people with attachment will commit crime, people with attachment will not commit crime, people without attachment will commit crime. So it's putting people into different groups. These people have attachment, so they won't commit crime. These people do not have attachment, so they will commit crime. Developmental theories are interested in this, which we'll refer to as between-person differences or between-group differences. But developmental theories are also interested in within individual change. So I'm not just interested in whether person A has attachment and person B doesn't, and therefore person B is more at risk of crime. What I want to do is create a longitudinal study that follows person A and person B over time and looks at, let's say we would have 6 measurement periods. We start at age 6 and we interview each person from age 6 once a year for the next 6 years. And we can look at whether their attachment to others moves up or down. Do they have stronger levels of attachment? And does this influence a change in offending, specifically a reduction in offending? Or when an individual experiences a decline in attachment, does this lead to an increase in their rate of offending? So it's about monitoring the individual over time. So we go from focusing on labels of groups to focusing on people and their transitions over time. Another way of thinking about theory is the difference between sociological theories and psychological theories. And this has led to kind of like debates or ideological divides within criminology. Some people are like, I'm a sociological criminologist, and others are, no, I'm a psychological criminologist. And really, sociological theories and psychological theories are they're kind of like two pieces of the same puzzle. They're trying to understand criminal behavior, but often different types of criminal behavior are using different perspectives. Psychological perspectives tend to focus on individuals. Sociological perspectives tend to focus more so on groups, or they might be considered more so macro level theories that try to understand differences in, let's say, crime rates. Why are crime rates higher in one area compared to another? And variables like age, gender, social class are kind of key variables to sociological perspectives. Psychological perspectives tend to be more like internal, or more like micro level theories. They look at the importance of socialization, family, but also individual level risk factors like oppositional defiant disorder, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, feelings, attitudes. to try and explain why a particular individual might have, say, a higher rate of offending compared to another person. So one of the basic goals of developmental theory is to make sense of what we see as a pretty common relationship across not just criminal behavior, but really any type of behavior. And that's that one of the best predictors of whether someone will do something in the future is whether they did that in the past. So for example, if you listen to this lecture on the Mac, you probably are going to listen to next week's lecture on the Mac. You'd be wrong because PC is better, but it's good to let you guys, make your mistakes while you're young. But what we really should be more interested in is why does this behavior continue over time? So developmental criminology tries to make sense of this by looking at the relationship between past behavior and future behavior and trying to unpack why this actually happens. So developmental theories will try and focus on this by looking at the initial behavior and what preceded it. So looking at the negative event or life experience, then looking at the repercussions that can come from a particular behavior. So things that might weaken, so after the behavior receives a punishment, how might that weaken an individual's ties to society? Or if the response to the behavior was positive, maybe that will reinforce or strengthen their incentive to engage in positive behavior. And that can then in turn explain future behavior. So we can see that the link between past behavior and future behavior is based on this chain of events that actually unfolds over time. So two important ideas to think about in developmental criminology are the notions of pathways and trajectories. So pathways describe stepping stones towards different types of behavior, usually an escalation in behavior. So let's take a toddler, for example. They might begin by throwing temper tantrum, and then when parents try to introduce them to play dates, they might not share their toys, they hit other children with toys, and they go to school and they begin acting out. They're being violent towards teachers or other students, they're not listening to teachers, and they're reacting very negatively. And then over time they become a teenager and they begin to engage in things like a robbery, so more instrumental forms of violence. Before they were reacting to their environment and getting upset and being violent. Now they are, without any sort of provocation from their environment, they're acting instrumentally aggressive. So we're looking at qualitatively different types of behavioral patterns over time. That's this pathway perspective. The trajectory perspective looks at the quantitative nature of behavior. This means the frequency of behavior. So we saw this in week 1 with the trajectory that I showed you of individuals from our young offender study, where we're looking at, for example, how many different crimes does a person engage in at age 12, and then at age 13, at age 14, and so on, so we can trace this behavior over time. So this is more of a quantitative description of criminal behavior. So there are two really important developmental theories that we can talk about in this class. One is Patterson's coercion theory, and there's a great example of this theoretical perspective if you watch Animal Kingdom. It's a Hollywood TV show, but it's also a phenomenal movie that was done originally in Australia. And it sort of identifies the role of parents and family in impacting a person's trajectory over the life course. So basically what the theoretical perspective suggests is that there are two different types or pathways to criminal behavior. One begins very early in the life course, and this is characterized by individuals who are exposed to really negative parental backgrounds, parents fighting, you could see divorce, substance use by the parents. The child is exposed to this quite early, and then this leads to their involvement in criminal behavior at a very young age. This is a really important term. It's called the age of onset of offending. The earlier that someone begins to offend, the longer their offending is likely to continue. So Patterson's coercion developmental theory identified these early starters as kids, usually before age 14, that are exposed to a really chaotic, negative family home environment, and this leads to a life course of offending. Then there are other individuals that might come into sort of just a more neutral family situation, maybe where parents are very lax, kind of ignore, do not punish, do not praise the child or just kind of give a very lenient parenting style. And this individual doesn't get much supervision, and that sort of frees up their opportunities to engage in criminal behavior. So this theoretical perspective is essentially saying that there are two different pathways to criminality, and these different pathways lead to different trajectories of criminal behavior. One defined by high rates of offending over the life course, one is defined more by intermittent low rate offending that's maybe just confined to the period of adolescence. So basically how Patterson's coercion theory works, that we see this connection between involvement in antisocial behavior and future criminal behavior. And this all stems from poor parental monitoring. So this poor parental monitoring influences antisocial behavior. This antisocial behavior can then influence an association with delinquent peers. So they engage in negative behavior at school, and that influences their association with other deviant peers. And now they have a social group that supports their involvement in crime that's going to lead to continued involvement in crime. So this link between past and future criminal behavior can be explained by first parental monitoring, and then later association with delinquent peers, and then a peer group that supports this criminal behavior. Okay, so one of my heroes is Terry Moffat, and she developed what's called Moffat's dual taxonomy. She looked at the state of criminology. She's actually more of a psychologist, but she had an interest in crime and the development of personality traits and things like that. And she looked at criminology and said, why are all of these theories designed only to explain, like, all offenders are explained by the same risk factors? She said perhaps there are different types of offenders following different trajectories, and we need to have unique explanations for these different groups. We can't keep assuming that we'll have these theoretical ideas or these theoretical constructs and they'll be able to explain all offenders of all different types. Basically, she said maybe there are different offenders characterized by different trajectories and different pathways to these trajectories or different risk factors. So she came up with this idea of adolescent limited versus life course persistent offenders. So here's the thing, Moffat ends up being wrong. She suggested that there were only two groups of offenders, and we're beginning to see that maybe there are more than two distinct trajectories. And she said that one of these groups was adolescent limited, but these individuals tend to stop offending maybe towards adulthood as opposed to in adolescence only. But so we have adolescent limited and life course persistent as Moffat's two offending trajectories, and these individuals are thought to be explained by different risk factors. So I'll begin with a discussion of adolescent limited offenders. So according to Moffat, these are individuals that show no signs of antisocial or criminal behavior in childhood. It's not until about age 15 or 16 that they begin to engage in criminal behavior. Moffat says that the reason why they first begin to engage in criminal behavior is because of a process of what she calls social mimicry. They see other individuals engage in crime, they see the rewards of crime, the ability to seem like they're more mature, more independent, they have money, maybe jewelry, watches, cars, they're able to do different activities, go on trips, concerts, see Canuck games. So the adolescent limited offender sees this adult status and wants to obtain it for themselves. And they might be normally like a pro-social individual, but in adolescence, getting a part-time job at minimum wage isn't going to allow you to really do these things. So they see crime as an alternative to sort of showcasing their adult-like skills and their adult status, even though they're not yet an adult. The reason why they stop engaging in criminal behavior is because once they reach adulthood, they're able to go out and get like careers, not just a job, but a career, and this increases the consequences of engaging in crime. They don't want to engage in crime because they might lose their job. And their job is providing them with the things that they wanted in adolescence, that money, status, the ability to buy a car, get a house, and so on. Around this time, individuals might also have kids, get married, and these social ties can also increase the cost of offending. So that's why individuals won't engage in crime if they're associated with this adolescent limited offending trajectory. On the other hand, the life course persistent offending trajectory is characterized by individuals that show signs of antisocial and criminal behavior early in childhood, like by age 5, they're engaging in misbehavior. And Moffat says that this is because of the intersection of two factors. So this is what's really important to understand. It is the combination of having a neuropsychological deficit and experiencing family adversity that leads to life course persistent offending. If an individual is characterized by only a neuropsychological deficit or only by family adversity, according to Moffat, they won't fall into this life course persistent offending pattern. It has to be the intersection of the two. So a neuropsychological deficit usually refers to some form of mental disorder. This could be attention deficit hyperactive disorder, conduct disorder, showing features of psychopathy, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and so on. Family adversity would be things like witnessing intimate partner violence between parents, child poverty, exposure to parents that are using drugs and alcohol, or parents are involved in criminal behavior, and so on. So why do these individuals continue to engage in criminal behavior over the life course? For adolescent limited offenders, they enter adult roles that increase the cost of crime and tie individuals to these roles so they don't want to offend. These types of turning points don't really happen to life course persistent offenders, according to Moffat. This is because of a process of cumulative consequences or cumulative disadvantage. So what happens is this individual in childhood has this neuropsychological deficit and family adversity, and maybe they're not prepared to enter school, but they do so anyways. And while in school, they misbehave. And this misbehavior alienates them from peers and from teachers, and this can lead to them falling in with like the wrong crowd, some more delinquent individuals who are going to reinforce the misbehavior of this individual. This individual might be encouraged to drop out of school. And by dropping out of school, it decreases their connections to pro-social peers even further, and that might impact their education. Maybe they're not going to graduate, or they're going to graduate but they don't have any skills or career opportunities, and they can't get into a trade school or a college or university. So they're left with very limited options for those types of social bonds that Moffat said were going to characterize adolescent limited offenders. So this is why life course persistent offenders continue to offend throughout the life course. Now, keep in mind, this is just a theory. It does not mean that this is true, that there are two types of offenders, this is what their risk factors look like, and this is what their trajectories look like. The reality is that there are actually maybe even more than two types of offending trajectories. A lot of trajectory studies find about 4 or 5 different unique offending patterns. When people have tested Moffat's adolescent limited trajectory, what they found is that these individuals do not tend to stop offending right around adulthood. And this is maybe because of the new nature of my generation and your generation, which is when you turn age 18, you don't really walk right into your career. Most of us are going to go to a trade school, a college, or university. We need some form of post-secondary education to fall into our dream job. And so this sort of delays our entry into adult roles, so maybe that's why individuals continue to offend for a little bit longer. Pedersen's coercion development theory and Moffat's dual taxonomy are two key developmental theories. In addition to theories, there are also different risk factors that developmental criminology tends to emphasize. And one of the goals is to try to not confine itself to just sociological risk factors or just psychological risk factors. In the past, criminology has been fairly ideological in wanting to sort of pick a side, whereas the risk factor paradigm really wants to look at whatever risk factor matters, we want to focus on it. So this means looking at social risk factors, parental and family risk factors, and then individual level risk factors, or risk factors that are internal to the individual. Usually here we're talking about psychological risk factors. So when it comes to social risk factors, this is a shot of The Couch from The Wire. It's a TV show. If you haven't seen it, I'd say it's probably the single best TV show you could ever watch to get a good understanding of the development of crime, especially in low-income areas. And some of the focus of this show is on things like poverty and peer rejection. So one of the things that's really important to understand about poverty is that most individuals that experience poverty do not actually go on to engage in criminal behavior. So you want to be really careful when we're talking about risk factors to avoid labeling concerns. Just because somebody is in poverty doesn't mean we should look at them as being a person that's at risk of offending. But what poverty can do is increase exposure to a wide range of other risk factors. So individuals who experience poverty tend to also live in high crime neighborhoods, which can expose individuals to delinquent peers. or individuals could experience peer rejection. What starts first? Do individuals get rejected by prosocial peers, and that leads to association with delinquent peers, or do individuals just sort of naturally begin to associate with delinquent peers? And the research tends to suggest that individuals first get rejected from prosocial peers, and then look to hang out with less prosocial peers, so more antisocial peers. So what this suggests is that at an early age, we need to find ways to make sure that kids that are struggling to make friends don't fall into the wrong crowd, that they do have some sort of after-school activity, some sort of peer group to attach to, so that they don't feel like the only recourse they have is to hang out with individuals who are maybe a little bit more antisocial. We can also look at the family unit. So the TV show that I mentioned, Animal Kingdom, also a great movie, a better movie than the TV show. It's a good example of the influence of family on offending. We also have in the Lower Mainland a great example of the Bacon brothers and the Bacon family. Their parents were really quite neglectful, but they came from a middle-class family. Yet they became involved in a lot of very serious offenses. So we can look at the family both from the parent side and the peer side. So with the parent side, we'll look at parenting style. And the two types of parenting styles that we're most concerned with are the neglectful parenting style and the authoritarian parenting style. And the neglectful parenting style is exactly as it sounds. These individuals parent by just letting their kid run wild. They don't really show any care for that individual, positive or negative. They just leave the child to sort of fend for themselves. The authoritarian parenting style is kind of a more coercive parenting style. A lot of shouting, yelling, perhaps corporal punishment, so physical abuse of the child. The difference between an authoritarian parenting style and authoritative parenting style is if a child gets sent to his room or her room, an authoritative parenting style will explain to the child why they're being punished. If a child asks an authoritarian parent why they're being punished, the authoritarian parent will say, because I told you. Why is this happening to me? Because I'm your parent, because I said so. So that's what we would be looking at for family parental risk factors. When it comes to family sibling risk factors, we'd be looking especially at older brothers, older sisters that might influence criminal behavior. So the younger sibling might witness the older sibling be positively rewarded for criminal behavior, and thus might engage in criminal behavior themselves. Psychological risk factors include a whole host of different internal disorders. ADHD, conduct disorder, and oppositional defiant disorder are three fairly common risk factors that we'll look at in childhood. And then we'll also look at some of the more serious disorders such as psychopathy or features of psychopathy. We never diagnose anyone with psychopathy as an adolescent, and even talking about something like callous unemotional traits can be very dangerous. It's not just the label that we're concerned about, but what happens, like imagine you're a clinician and you tell a parent that their child has callous unemotional traits. How might that impact the parent's relationship to the child? Might the parent sort of give up on the child or feel that they failed and therefore not exert as much effort in trying to ensure that this child is getting the proper care? Talk about things like callous unemotional traits and features of psychopathy. One of the most important things to know is that these aren't fixed traits. Just because a kid shows callous unemotional traits at one point in time does not mean that they will definitely show callous unemotional traits in their teenage years or as an adult. But a great depiction of callous unemotional traits is in the movie We Have to Talk About Kevin. So we're going to watch a little clip, and then we can talk about it hopefully in the discussion of your tutorial sections.
Can you say ball? 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 No? Okay. I'm gonna throw it to you. You're gonna roll it back to me. Okay? Okay. Roll it back to mommy. Yeah. Roll it back. No, roll it back to mommy. Okay. Okay. Roll it back. Okay. Just roll it back. When he was a baby, he never stopped screaming. I thought maybe it had damaged his hearing.
Oh, his hearing's fine.
But shouldn't he be talking by now? I read somewhere that non-verbalizing was an early sign of autism.
He has none of the telltale rocking signs. I wouldn't worry about it too much. He's a floppy little boy, isn't he? But there's nothing wrong with him.
Thank you. Okay. Roll it back to mommy. Oh. Ah! Yay! 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 Okay. Gonna roll it back again. That was really good, Kev. Okay. Here we go. Okay? Okay?
One of the things I wanted to also mention before the video was that there are two types of empathy. Individuals can show cognitive empathy and emotional empathy. And it's generally believed that it's fairly difficult to teach someone to have emotional empathy. So emotional empathy is like that actual feeling you get when you see someone else hurt or going through a difficult time and you literally feel their pain. Cognitive empathy is more just the ability to understand that somebody else is going through a difficult time and that's causing them distress. So an individual might not necessarily feel that pain themselves, but they can understand it and they will avoid inflicting that type of pain on another person because they can understand why that might be negative. So one of the things that I find really interesting is how do we go about measuring things like callous and emotional traits? So in adults, it's fairly, not easy, but it's easier where we can ask individuals a series of questions, listen to their answers, provide follow-up questions to get a sense of whether they care about people that they are surrounded by, their friends, their family, a spouse, children. Do they actually seem to have any emotional attachment to the people that they are supposed to be most caring towards? Very difficult to look at that with children. How do you ask a child who's 2, 3, 4 years old if they care about their mom and dad? How they help their mom and dad when their mom or dad are feeling sad or down? They might not even really understand these questions. So Paul Frick, who is maybe one of the most renowned researchers on callous and emotional traits, he developed a way to assess for callous and emotional traits by relying on basically it's called positron emission topography. It's a brain scan that looks at the functioning of the brain, so you can see what aspects or areas of the brain are firing. There's also another thing that's called fMRI scans, functional magnetic resonance imaging, and this will look at the shape and the structure of the brain, but what PET scans, that positron emission topography scan, will do is actually look at the functioning of the brain. And so what Paul Frick and his team have done is give these scans to children, and then they'll show them different pictures, so like fire hydrant, brick, a person crying, grass. Fire hydrant, brick, a person crying, grass.
You'll go person, woman, man, camera, TV. Person, woman, man, camera, TV. Okay, that's very good.
And repeat these sort of images over and over again to see how an individual actually responds. So again, this fire hydrant, brick, a child crying, grass, tennis ball, and what they're looking for is a different emotional response, or just a different response in the brain to the child crying compared to these more neutral inducing stimuli. And when they find individuals whose brain does not tend to change regardless of the photo, those individuals are believed to have callous and emotional traits. And they use these readings to predict antisocial behavior in the future, and they find that it is relatively accurate. The individuals who do not react to these negative images or painful images are the individuals who tend to have more callous unemotional traits and tend to go on to engage in antisocial and criminal behavior later in the life course. Alright, last slide. So I don't know if you can tell, but it's gotten like so much darker since I first started recording, because I would record and then it was so hot in my apartment and I'm shooting on my phone that it would just fry my phone and stop recording, so I lost footage over and over and over again. So I'm very happy that we are on the last slide here. It's 9:38 and I'm ready for dinner, so we're going to talk about ADHD. So the symptoms of ADHD include inattention, impulsivity, and if you haven't noticed, excessive motor activity, moving around, things like that. And there's a very important genetic component to ADHD. So twin studies show that individuals that are monozygotic twins, and we'll learn about this next week, monozygotic twins are identical twins, they're more likely to both have ADHD compared to individuals that are dizygotic twins that are really no more genetically similar than two biological siblings that are not twins. What's interesting about ADHD from like a medical perspective is that individuals tend to be very hyperactive. So you might think that to treat ADHD you'd want a depressant, something that is going to mellow people out. But really the way to treat ADHD is to actually give individuals drugs that stimulate the brain, because the ADHD brain is essentially underactive and is looking around for stimulation, so drugs will, along with treatment, help to curb that need for stimulation. I want to also talk about oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder. These two are they're very, very similar, but they tend to happen at different stages. So individuals will they'll show signs of oppositional defiant disorder, and then some individuals will also begin to show signs of conduct disorder. Individuals with conduct disorder really do not tend to not have ODD. So all individuals with conduct disorder would also have met the criteria for oppositional defiant disorder. Individuals with ODD tend to kind of be negative, hostile, and defiant towards authority figures or people who are responsible for telling them what to do. This is not something that all kids will be oppositional at some point in time. So it has to be over a period of at least 6 months where they demonstrate this behavior. It's also fairly common for individuals with ODD to have ADHD. There's a real key difference between ODD and conduct disorder, or CD. Individuals with ODD tend to not act out until somebody has, in their view, antagonized them by telling them what to do, where to go, things like that. Individuals with conduct disorder tend to not need any provocation before they engage in antisocial behavior. There are two types of conduct disorder based on the onset, so before age 10 or after age 10. Before age 10, we're more concerned about that type of conduct disorder. Always keep in mind that the earlier something happens, the more likely the symptoms are to be severe and lead to increased and longer periods of offending behavior. So one of the other problems with conduct disorder, remember Moffat talked about cumulative consequences or cumulative disadvantage. Having conduct disorder tends to alienate individuals from peers, so this can lead to peer rejection. So such individuals can begin to accumulate different risk factors. So that's it for week number 2. I know that it's not the most exciting material, but this is sort of the common ground that we need to be on before we move forward for the rest of the class. So hope you enjoy the rest of the week. We'll see you in the discussion sections of your tutorial plans.